much for that nice introduction, Jim. I'm really happy to be here for the San Diego Storytelling Festival. And as you may know, it is World Storytelling Day. And the theme for this year for World Storytelling Day is New Beginnings. So I'd like to tell you a story about new beginnings. And it's also a story about a cow, but it doesn't start with a cow. And it's a story about a sheep, but it doesn't start with a sheep. And it's a story about a dress, a black silk dress that was owned by a woman named Jessie Garner Freckleton. It was 1863. Jessie and her husband John hadn't been married long. They lived in Scotland and were part of proper and prosperous families, but they decided to come to America. So they got together enough money to make the voyage, and the trip across the ocean in a sailing ship, and the trip across the plains in a covered wagon. Well, they were not without trial. But there was the joy of the journey and the anticipation of a new beginning. When they arrived in what was then the Utah Territory, the Salt Lake Valley, Salt Lake City, after Edinburgh, it seemed like a small, uncultured, provincial place to Jessie. But they were happy to be there, and they didn't know what was coming. Because the next spring, with their new baby, they moved south to a small town called Goshen. And if Salt Lake had seemed small and uncivilized, well, Goshen was smaller still. But Jessie and John, they jumped right into the community there. And they were much admired. Jessie had a beautiful soprano voice, and John a lovely baritone as they sang the songs from the old world. Flow Gently, Sweet Afton, and others. And John was known for his lively step dancing. Now, Jessie had arrived with one great treasure. They didn't bring much with them. They couldn't bring much with them from Scotland, but she had a black silk dress. It was beautiful, a heavy quality silk, cut in a classic style and with a row of jet buttons down the bodice. And when Jessie and John showed up at church or other events, they were much admired. And no one admired Jessie and her silk dress more than Sister Jensen. Sister Jensen one day after meeting came to Jessie and said, "I'd like to buy that dress." Well, Jessie didn't think once and she didn't think twice. She said no. "Well, I could trade for it," said Sister Jensen. "Surely there must be something that your family needs." But Jessie turned her down, and she turned her down again and again and again as Sister Jensen came back with more and more offers to buy or trade that dress. Well, a year later, with another baby, they moved south further still to a town called Deseret. And if Salt Lake City had seemed small and Goshen smaller still, well, Deseret was just hardly a wide spot in the road. They lived in a dugout with a sod roof and a log wall in the front with one door and a small window. And John applied himself to farming. Now, he had no experience, and he was an enthusiastic and hardworking, but not particularly able farmer. So they struggled. And after a while, one of the big concerns that Jessie had was their clothes. The clothes that they'd brought from Scotland weren't really work clothes. She had the black silk dress and two others that were serviceable, and they could cut down old clothes for the children. But John, what he had was in rags, almost indecent. Well, Jessie was thinking about that, and she thought about something that her grandmother had always told her: the Lord will provide. It was in the spring that Jessie was folding and putting away the winter things, including the two heavy, fine gray wool blankets that they'd brought from the old country. And as she ran her hand over those blankets, she got an idea. And she didn't think once, she didn't think twice, but she got her scissors and began to cut so there'd be no going back. She took apart an old suit of John's and she used it as a pattern. And after several days of steady hand sewing, John had a new suit, gray wool. So when they showed up at church on Sunday, Jessie in the black dress and John in a new gray suit, well, Jessie was feeling very proud of her accomplishment, and deservedly so. And her pleasure was only dimmed just a bit when she thought about what they would use to keep warm when winter came. But again, she reminded herself of what her grandmother had said, the Lord will provide. One day, Jessie was on the outskirts of the community. She was gathering some firewood, and she noticed something. It would be hard to say if she noticed it first with her eyes or with her nose. It was a sheep, dead, very, very dead, stiff, bloated, decomposing, but it still wore its fleece. Jessie ran home and got a big burlap sack and a piece of cloth, and she ran back to that dead sheep, hoping that nobody else had found that treasure before she could get back. Well, she tied that cloth around her nose and mouth, something that's familiar to most of us these days. And she began to pull the wool from that sheep carcass and put it in the bag. And she would work for a while, and then she would go away and breathe and then go back to work. And finally, after several hours, she had an entire bag full of dirty, smelly wool. She dragged that bag back to the house. And on the way, she ran into John. Now, he'd always had kind of a sensitive nose and a sensitive stomach. And he said, Jessie, I don't know what you've got in that sack, but you better get rid of it. It's making me sick. But she didn't get rid of it. She wouldn't get rid of it. She needed what was in that sack. That very evening, she got a big pot, filled it with water and wood ashes, and she boiled the fleece and let the ashes sink to the bottom, added more ashes, boiled it again and again. And after several days, she had nice, sweet smelling wool. Then she borrowed some carding combs from a neighbor, and she began to card that fleece until finally she ended up with soft, fluffy bats. Then she took up her needle, and after several weeks of almost constant sewing, she had warm quilts to put on their beds when winter came. Truly, the Lord had provided. Another child was born there. And as I said, John was a hardworking but not particularly able farmer, and the weather had not cooperated. And then there was a plague of locusts that ate what had actually grown. They decided to move back to Goshen, another new beginning. Well, after being in Deseret, Goshen seemed like a thriving metropolis to Jessie, and they were warmly welcomed by old friends. It was not even a week before Sister Jensen appeared at the door. Do you still have the dress, Jessie? I do. Well, I'd still like to buy it. Isn't there something that you want? Well, this time Jessie did think once, and she did think twice. And maybe it's because they were beginning again, starting all over. Or maybe it's because now she had 4 small children. Or maybe it's just because a woman can get tired of a dress, even a really nice dress, after about a decade. So she said to Sister Jensen, what will you trade? A 3-year-old heifer. It should be a good milk cow. And Jessie said, I'll trade. So that evening after supper, Brother Jensen came by with the cow. Jessie folded up that beautiful dress and ran her hand down the jet buttons on the bodice for the last time. She handed that dress to Brother Jensen, and he left the cow. And then the family gathered. They had an important decision to make. What should they name that cow? Well, there were several suggestions. The traditional, Bessie or Bossy or Molly. Someone suggested maybe they name it Victoria after the Queen. But then John had a thought. He told the others, and they all nodded in agreement. They decided to name the cow Dress. And that's a story of several new beginnings, and a sheep, and a cow, and a dress.